Hello, my friends of sophisticated color grading. Today we have a closer look at the stack structure inside Baselight and especially regarding keying. So let's dive directly into Baselight. Let's have a look at the keyers inside Baselight. On my first shot, I'm adding a layer 2 below my layer 1, and in that layer I want to use a keyer. What's the best way of doing that? In the UI, I'm going here on the top right to the matte operators selector. So here I can select the matte operators for the currently selected layer, and this is the whole list. And 3 of these operators are keyers. That is the DKey, the matte RGB, and the HueAngle. We will not go into the details of the operation of these 3 keyers today, but I will explain more the fundamental process of keying in Baselight and how it works in the stack. So let's attach a DKey to the layer 2. We can see that Baselight automatically added a reference strip and a DKey strip to the layer 2 in the stack. And the DKey strip is automatically selected. So we are ready to do some keying. So I can go into the image and, for example, do a pick here on that green part of the flag. To see the matte signal of the currently selected layer, I can go to my cursor settings and here set the rendering, for example, to layer matte. Then I see the black and white signal. White is now what will be treated in the inside part of the layer and with the inside operators, and what is black will be treated with the operators in the outside stack. It's easier to access that preview through the O key on the keyboard. So with O, I can toggle that on and off. On a blackboard, that button is labeled Layer Matte. When I'm pressing Shift O, you can see that I'm cycling through different modes for that matte signal. The same you can access by pressing Control Layer Matte on the grading panel. So 1, which we call the layer matte, is the black and white signal. 1 is the layer matte overlay mode. There we overlay the matte with a defined color, which you can define here. So if you don't like that very electric green, then you can change that here with the color panel. You can also decide if the overlay should be opaque or only partly opaque. And that green color has the advantage that it's rarely seen in any kind of realistic image, so it's always good to spot the layer matte overlay. The third mode is what we call the layer matte invert overlay. There basically we have a gray image, and every part of the image that is qualified through the matte is seen with its native RGB color values. Whichever mode you prefer, I personally prefer for most cases the layer matte overlay mode. Baselight remembers that, and now whenever I press O, it now toggles just between this mode on and off, which is very convenient. I'm adding another layer, layer 3, and now I'm using the matte RGB keyer inside layer 3. You can see it's the same stack structure. We have a reference strip, then the matte RGB strip, which is selected, and both of them are on top of the layer strip where we have our inside and outside operators. A much faster way to attach a keyer to a grading layer is through the grading panels. For that, just press the respective button in the matte operators row in the Stack Manager section on the grading panel. For the HueAngle keyer, there's also a keyboard shortcut available on my keyboard, which is the H key, which I'm pressing now. And you can see I have layer 4 selected. I'm pressing the H key, and it immediately attaches a HueAngle keyer to my layer 4. I can do my selection and quickly overlay it here with the O key. You should always add keyers through either the UI here, through the matte operators selecting column, or through the grading panel with the respective button. Don't add keyers through the insert menu, because then you have to do a few manual steps in the stack to get the correct wiring of the strips. Let's examine the node graph in our stack to get a better understanding what is going on. I'm adding 2 more regular layers. We can see that a normal layer in Baselight has 1 input connection and 1 output connection in that cyanish color here. The cyanish color indicates a color image flowing through the stack. So layer 5, for example, takes the output of layer 4 and hands it over to the input of layer 6. Whenever a layer has a matte operator attached to it, then that layer has 2 inputs and 1 output. The first input is always the matte signal, so that is fed by the strips directly above the layer strip. And the second input in that case is here then the image that is coming in. So first the matte in white, and the second one is the image flowing through. So here we can see that the color image has a very simple structure here in that stack. It just goes from top to bottom, from layer 0 down to layer 12. And 3 of these layers, layer 2, layer 3, and layer 4, they have a matte input that comes also into the layer. We can see that a layer has 2 inputs open in that section here of the layer parameters. Here it says use matte for grade. For a regular layer like layer 5, it is set to no matte input. That means 1 input, 1 output for the layer. So a simple image in, image out. If one of these matte options here is selected, then it means 2 inputs, 1 output for the layer. We can see the same thing here on the second shot with these layer 3 and layer 4s. They both have a shape attached to it, so it's a very simple structure. Layer 4 here has use matte for grade active. That means the layer expects 2 inputs, and the first one is the matte, which in this case is a simple shape, and the second input is the output from layer 3, the image flowing through the stack. Okay, going back to our first shot, for example layer 4, we can see that 3 strips belong to the layer 4 here. We can see that through the roundness of the strips. Notice that layer 4 has rounded corners on the bottom and the reference has roundness on the top. Also, we can fold down all the strips of layer 4 with that folding icon here. So a keyer always has a reference strip attached on top of it. Baselight is a very modular system. So a lot of the operators can be combined similar to complex compositing tools in a modular way. The keying operators, for example, and that's the same for DKey, MatteRGB, and HueAngle, they expect an RGB image as the input coming in, and they convert that RGB image into a black and white matte image and output that matte signal on the bottom. Let's examine that by stepping through the stack. I'm moving my row cursor upwards. Here we can see that the reference is outputting a color image, an RGB image, and that image goes into the HueAngle strip. At the bottom of the HueAngle strip, we have a black and white signal, and that is then going into layer 4. So the reference is there to feed an keying input image into the keyer. And we can see from the reference a dotted line all the way up to layer 0. So that means this reference here is referencing layer 0. So the reference is taking the ungraded layer 0 image and bringing it all the way down here so that the HueAngle keyer can pull the key from the ungraded image. With the reference strip, I can decide which image are we using to pull the key from. So it has no influence on the actual cyanish image that is flowing through the stack. It only influences basically the black and white matte signal that we're generating in the HueAngle keyer. And so if we wanted to key the image from the layer 2 output, I can go into the reference and set this to, for example, layer 2 output, or we can also select it here directly in the stack. Now we can see that reference here is taking the output of layer 2, but the other 2 references are still keying from layer 0, the ungraded image, which is the default in Baselight. You can change the default mode for the reference in the preferences. Here I'm searching for reference, default mode. It's on the operators page here under reference, and here I can decide what makes sense as the default mode for reference strips. Some people prefer to have this set to layer 1 or layer 2, and that can make sense if they're always doing a basic color balance in layer 1, and layer 0 always has the completely uncolor balanced input. It can sometimes be easier to pull, for example, a HueAngle key from a color balanced image. But you need to be aware that if you're applying a strong grade in layer 1, it might already degrade your keying possibilities. Okay, let's examine that modular approach in more detail on the next shot. Here I'm adding a new layer and I want to pull a skin tone key. So I'm pressing H to attach a HueAngle to my layer 5. I'm going to the image, doing my initial pick. I can see the overlay here. Now we can also see the advantage of that overlay mode. So I can now easily go here and extend the HueAngle ranges with a command click on that section here. And now I can go in and fine tune my key a little bit. Something like this. We can see that the key is a bit noisy here. So typically we want to add some kind of blur to the key. We have some roll-off settings here inside our keyer, and in the other ones, for example, inside DKey, we have a softness parameter, but we don't have an actual parameter to blur the key. And the reason for that is the modular approach. So the keying strips, they treat every pixel by itself. So they just perform the process of pulling the key based on the color input. They don't do any spatial operation. So if I would leave the key in that mode here, the key would be LUT bakeable and would be a per pixel operation. But if we want to blur the key, we need to attach a matte tool to the layer. And this is what we do here with that button. Here we have the Edit Matte Tool tick box. I click that and Baselight automatically attaches a matte tool in between the HueAngle and the layer strip here in the stack. So the matte tool is a tool that expects a matte signal as input, let's say unprocessed matte as input from the keyer, and outputs a processed matte signal. And the most common operation of the matte tool is applying a blur, for example. So now I turn the layer matte overlay off and step again through the stack. Here we can see our ungraded layer 0. HueAngle pulls the key from the color image, and then the matte tool processes the matte before it is fed into the matte input of layer 5. On the Blackboard Classic grading panel, you create and select the matte tool with the blur button. Let's see a few more examples. On this shot, I applied a pretty strong grade. We can see here a simple base correction, then a very strong look that makes the image basically monochromatic, then also some spatial processing on top of that. And now if I'm adding a layer below, and let's say I wanted to key that red train here, I can of course do that because the reference is referencing the ungraded input. So you can see I'm getting a decent keying signal here. So let's extend that range a bit. The reference is pointing to layer 0, where we have a color image. From the color image, we're pulling the key. We can then, for example, blur the key a little bit, and then it goes into layer 14. And here we could do whatever we want. We could, for example, just simply tint that section, or we could do something more advanced. We could say, use the matte for the blend. and then I'm opening the layer flow graph, and for the blend, I'm now choosing, for example, layer 1, our base correction. So now I can blend back, for example, the output of layer 1 here into layer 14. You can see that with the dotted cyanish line. So this is the second input to that layer 14, referencing the output of layer 1. Cyan is a color image, and white is the matte signal that is generated here. If I wanted to grade that red color, I could attach my grading operators to this branch here by clicking here on the check mark. So now my grading operators are on that branch. And now I could even say, let's tint it even a little bit stronger red. So this is a typical example where keying from layer 0 is making a lot of sense. And that is true for many keys in color grading, but not all of them. So let's have a look at examples where we don't want to reference layer 0 as input to the key, but do something else. Here we have a very broad skin tone key, also with a lot of blur added to it. And we can see that the key is not referencing layer 0, but previous layer's output instead. So that means that the key is reacting to whatever I'm doing here upstream in my stack, in that case inside layer 1. So when I'm grading the image inside layer 1, we can see that this strongly affects the keying signal. Let's do something very obvious. I go to the outside of the key, video grade gain, and pull that all the way down to black. Now if I go back to layer 1 and regrade my image, we can see how the key is reacting to my grading inside layer 1 here. Of course, I don't want to have such a grade, so I'm resetting the video grade operator here. And inside that layer, I'm grading the image a little bit warmer on the inside and a bit colder on the outside, so we get that cold-warm separation. And this is something that I would consider more of a look style operation. So that one adds something to the look. And in that case, I want the look to react to my grading. So let's go to the next shot and apply the layer 2. And what we should see is, yeah, it does a rough key here on the skin. But if I'm going in here and adjusting my color balance on the shot, we should see that it then also optimizes the image for the key. So when I have the correct color balance, then also the key should fit nicely to the shot. And the same thing here. Let's grab our key layer and go into our base correction. And we should see that the moment we hit a good color balance in our layer 1, then the key is also working nicely. And that is without, that is with the keying layer. So for these kind of layers where the operation should react to the stack above, there set the reference of the key to previous layers output. Personally, I call these more look dev layers. And for regular keys, there use the normal layer 0, layer 1 or layer 2 output, depending on your grading style. But I think leaving it on layer 0, like the default, is not a bad idea. On the next shot, we have another example of a key that is reacting to the grading. You can see it here directly. The reference is pointing to previous layer's output. So here the dotted white line goes to the output of layer 3. And so this is a highlight key here. So in HueAngle, I used the highest preset and probably adjusted it a little bit so that it's a really smooth roll off here for the highlights. Then I'm blurring the key a lot, and then inside the layer I'm then adding some negative sharpness and raising the lift in video grade and also tinting it a little bit with a golden color. So it's adding that kind of like golden glow to the highlights of the image. And the nice thing is with the reference on previous layers output, if I go into layer 1 and raise the exposure, you can see that now the glow reacts to my grading. So if I grade the image very dark, now we should have almost no glow or only a minimal amount of glow. And of course, if I grade it very bright, you can see now we have a lot of glow added to the image. One downside that this modular structure has is that you can't adjust the keying parameters and the blur of the matte at the same time. So we have to flip between matte tool here, for example, to adjust the blur, and HueAngle to adjust the key. On the blackboard, you would press the keying button, in this case HueAngle, and the blur button respectively to toggle between the operators, and you press the name of the grading operator, in that case, for example, video grade, so switch to this one. But that modular structure has, on the other side, several advantages. One is what I already mentioned. When we, for example, delete the matte tool, now we can ensure that this key is 100% per pixel, so it is LUT bakeable, for example, and also you have a clearer understanding if there is a spatial process involved or not. And another advantage I want to show on the last two examples in the timeline. On this shot, I want to key the green color of the liquor bottles in the background, and we can see that the key is quite noisy, and the reason for that is when we examine the shot in detail, there's a lot of color noise here in the shadows, and the key picks up that noise. Of course, we could now just apply a matte tool and blur the key, but we can also do something else. We can also treat the image on the way from the reference to the HueAngle, so we can treat the color image from which we are pulling the key. In this case, I'm adding a base grade operator, for example, in between the reference and the HueAngle. So we can see here in the node graph that the base grade is not treating the actual output image, it's just treating the matte on the way to the key. And in the base grade, I can, for example, raise the flare value. And we can see that this basically desaturates the deepest shadows, and it can help here pulling a cleaner key. So if we step through the stack, we can see here reference is our layer 0. Base grade is now a very grayish or lifted black version of that image. This is fed into the key where we are generating the black and white signal, and this is then going into the layer. Let's bypass the base grade and do something else. What we could do instead is, for example, inserting a temporal degrain operator, because this one here has a simple spatial denoising section. So I can also denoise the image, for example, before we're pulling the key. And this is something very different to blurring the result of the key. So this is the layer 0 living inside the reference, and this is the heavily denoised image that we are feeding into the HueAngle to pull that key. Let's stick with the base grade method. So I'm deleting the denoise strip. And of course, we can also combine both. I can now still add a matte tool and blur the result of the matte here at the bottom. So our stack looks like this. On the last shot, I'm coming back to our skin tone key here. And if we look really closely, we can see that the tip of the nose is not part of the key. And it's a little bit hard to grab inside that HueAngle key because it has a little bit of a different hue here in these highlights. So what we could try is grading the reference a little bit. So now I'm inserting, for example, a video grade operator in between reference and HueAngle. Maybe lift the black pivot a little bit here because we're grading in a log space. And now I can basically grade here with the gain, and you can see that we can now basically optimize our key to get a better result. With the grading panel, I would now have a much finer control, but I hope you can already see that going from here to here, we can get a better key, for example, here for our bright highlights on the nose. On top of that, we could add, for example, a soften operation that softens the image, and we can also see that this can deal with some of the noise, but not all of it, because as I said, it's a different operation doing a blur or soften here upstream of the key than downstream. You don't need to treat the signal on the way from the reference to the keying strip often. I would say that is only required in rare cases, but for difficult cases it can be very powerful. Let's remove these two additional strips and cover one last scenario. So far we only saw the keying strips as simple one input, one output strips. So the keying strip, as I mentioned, takes a color image as input and outputs a matte. But the keying strips can also have two inputs, and that's the typical way when we need to work with a garbage matte. Let's get the keying signal here up as an overlay again and examine the matte operators of that layer. We can see that here the HueAngle is blue, so that is active for the layer 5, and these other effects here we cannot add on that matte operator level anymore, but we can see we can still add, for example, reference, shape, paint, text, etc. And using a shape is by far the most common scenario in that case. So now I'm clicking the shape button on the same column here as the key. So that's the important thing here, not this one here, which would open up another level of matte input and then a MatteMerge operation that merges the two levels. I'm using the shape inside the same column here, or on the panel it's the same row. Now I'm drawing the shape and we see that this is now a garbage matte for the key. So what happens in the stack? We see that our HueAngle strip now is not one input, one output anymore, but now the HueAngle strip is also two inputs, one output. What happens here? The reference takes the image from layer 0 and puts it here into that strip. So that's, you can imagine this as a copy of the layer 0 strip here. This one is going into the second input of the HueAngle. The first input of the HueAngle is filled up by the shape. So basically the HueAngle strip has that garbage matting functionality built into it. So whenever in a keying strip the hues matte toggle here is active, we can see it here, it is active. For the other HueAngles or DKeys that we created, it's not active. So whenever the hues matte is active, then the HueAngle expects first the garbage matte as a signal here, which is our shape. And then as a second input, it expects the color image from which it pulls the key. So this is how that works. And so if I would now go in here and uncheck the use matte, we would see that now we get an unstable stack, because now the HueAngle only has one input, one output, and here we have the reference strip, and that doesn't make any sense. So in order to fix up that stack, I would need to delete the shape strip here. Then everything should work again, or I'm undoing and keeping the use matte button checked. So this is then an even more advanced stack structure when both the HueAngle strip is two input, one output, and the layer strip is basically two input, one output. And you will see a use matte button if we here attach a DKey, for example, for a key for the lips. You can see that every keying strip has that use matte toggle with which we can combine it, for example, with a garbage matte. The last thing I want to show you is how to remove a keyer properly from a layer. So here in layer 6, we go to the matte operators, and then in the UI, the best way of removing it is right-clicking here and resetting the DKey. We can see this deletes the reference strip, the DKey strip, and it also sets the layer 6 back to no matte input. I'm undoing this. If you instead go in here and just delete the DKey strip, you will then now have basically the reference as a matte signal into layer 6. So basically now the grading inside layer 6 will affect more the highlights of the image and less the shadows. So that's typically not what you want. Or if you manually delete these two strips here, then we also have a wrong output because now the whole layer 5 is inactive and it's just creating basically the whole stack. Upstream is now just creating in a complicated way a matte for our layer 14. So whenever you delete strips manually like that, ensure that you're always deleting the layer as a whole, or for example, fold it in and then just take this layer and delete it as a whole. Or the better way of removing certain matte operators in the UI is here through the matte operators view. And here we can, for example, remove the shape or the HueAngle, and now we're ending up with a completely normal layer without any matte. On the grading panel, you just hold down the Shift button and then press on the matte operator that you want to remove. So let's go here onto layer 4. Now I'm pressing Shift H, and we can see now our glow layer is applied to the overall image, and we can of course bypass that. But this is the fastest way of removing a keyer from a layer, holding Shift and pressing the respective matte operator button on the panel. Okay, let's wrap it up. Thanks for watching this tutorial with me, and yeah, I think, or I hope it was informative, especially for the beginners in Baselight to get a better feeling for the stack structure. I guess that can also be helpful with other operations like shapes, etc. And I see you for the next one. Bye bye.